I'll ask Dan to make a change on what he just said, if that's all right, because through my own failure, we are looking at the song Amazing Grace this morning, which I did not inform him of, and so it may be appropriate, if deemed necessary, to change the invitation song to number 12, which would be the song Amazing Grace, and Dan's agreeable to that. So number 12 will be the song for the invitation. So this morning, as I just told you, we are taking a look at a song that we sing. Of course, it's not just any song that we sing, but it happens to be one of the best known songs of all time. Whether in the church, whether outside of the church, it is immensely recognizable. And it's within the church, it's probably one of the most beloved hymns that we do sing. But what we want to also give this morning is some of the rich character that the song has, not just because of the words, but also because of the story that brought it about. And so we'll try to keep that on the briefer side. We'll take a look at the lyrics, and we'll take a look at how all of it applies to ourselves. And as we have done this in the past, and we're doing it this morning, it's always worth remembering that these songs that we sing are not just words on a page, but they are praises to God and reminders to us of what we need to know. And so it is worth our time, at least every so often, to take one of these and to break it down a little bit more and to think more about what it is that we're doing when we praise God. And so this morning, we are taking a look at this one song, and we'll take a look at some of the background of it to start out with. The song, or at least the words, were written in 1772, so that would be a few years before the Revolutionary War even begins. And the words were written initially as a poem, so separate from the music. The song would be published first in 1779, so it would take a few years for that to happen. But the song is written by, or the words are written by, a certain John Newton. And it is his story that makes this song a little bit more interesting, a little bit richer as we go into it. John Newton, who's British, and obviously living in the 1700s, he ends up as a sailor, but he ends up as a sailor within his teenage years. And after sailing for a little while, he was pressed into the British Navy. And so that was a practice at the time that you were all but forced into becoming a sailor for the British Navy, the Royal Navy. He would do that for a while. And in the course of time, as he's serving in that role, he would end up enslaved in Africa. And so it's kind of a strange turn of events to think about the 1700s, but this is a white British person being enslaved in Africa. And he would spend about 3 years in slavery there. Eventually he was rescued. Once he's rescued, he is brought back to Britain, but he almost dies on the way back. There's a rough storm off the coast of Ireland, and he comes very close to dying. And he, at least in his life, attributes that moment or that time of calling on God for mercy as being sort of a turning point for him. Although, that being said, he was already a little bit into it, but he would spend several years after that turning point of being a captain of and being a participant in and an investor in the African slave trade. And so, right from the start, we have kind of a strange story that one of our best known hymns then is written by someone who was a part of the African slave trade in the 1700s. Well, eventually, after growing a little bit closer toward God, his life would change quite a bit more than that. And so he would end up studying and becoming an Anglican priest, which of course that comes with its own problems, but he becomes an Anglican priest, and more than that, he becomes a well-known abolitionist. He would be an outspoken person against slavery, and largely drawing from his own experiences. And when we say that, we don't just mean he might have passed by a plantation somewhere. We mean he was going to Africa, physically removing humans from where they lived and selling them as resources to others. He was there. He experienced all of that. But he comes back around and again ends up as being someone who speaks out against that. Now this particular poem that he writes, there may not be any particular inspiration for it, one moment that we can find, as sometimes there is when we look at hymns. But instead, he seems to write this for a sermon that he's already going to be doing, and it happens to be on New Year's Day in 1772. But really, his whole life is going to kind of serve as the inspiration behind the words that we'll look at in just a second. The music itself, we know it by the one tune that we always sing it to, but over time it's actually been set to several different pieces of music. But this tune that we use is called New Britain. It's kind of an old tune, and it would become standard with this song over time. And of course, now the two are inseparable. As far as what happens after that point, sort of ironically, this song fades into obscurity in England. And it's not very popular there for a long period of time. Where it would see popularity is in the United States, particularly in the revivals of the late 1700s, early 1800s, that even the Restoration movement would come out of. And so it found a lot of success in those early frontier preaching days. And it was often used as an invitation song for those events as well. And so that kind of sets the stage for us looking at this historically. But the other historical factor here that's a great bit of irony is, of course, this song, Amazing Grace, would become a standard among spirituals, among African Americans, both that had been slaves, that were slaves still. This song gained immense popularity. There's an irony to that, but there's also a beauty to it in the way that one man's life was changed, and then in turn, many people found this song to be able to change them as well. So taking a look at the song, it's a short song, it's a simple song. That probably leads to part of its popularity. People like things that are short and sweet a lot of times. And the first verse, and these words, of course, we are greatly familiar with because this song is so well known, because we do know the song so well. But it starts out with the, again, perfectly recognizable line, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. So the title obviously is drawn from this opening phrase, but so is the basic message of the whole song, grace. That's it. Grace by itself. Every time we sing the song, we get a couple of minutes to reflect on grace. What could be better than that? What could we do that would be more worthwhile than thinking about God's grace for just a few minutes? And of course, the question that we can kind of ask with this is, with Amazing Grace, how sweet is that sound? That might sound a little bit corny maybe, but that is the point, isn't it? When we look at grace, what does it mean to us? That's that kind of reflection that we want when we sing a song like this. How sweet is it to me, personally? Or is it just something that I hear those words of grace and I think, okay. It's one of those things the Bible talks about, but personally it doesn't have a lot of effect. That certainly can become the case. Next phrase there, that saved a wretch like me. Okay, let's spend just a second on that word wretch, because that's not really a word that we use pretty much ever unless we're singing this song. So it can mean a lot of different things actually, but basically it means someone who is we might call him a scoundrel, by other words, an unfortunate person. And usually you kind of mean that sort of bad character, but in this case we're talking about ourselves. Maybe a somewhat interesting note. The word wretch comes from a German word that means a banished person. So if you want to get more literal with the original meaning, what we're saying is that this amazing grace saved someone like me. Someone like what? Well, one, someone of bad character, and two, someone that was banished. Someone that was cast out. Someone that was on the outside. And certainly we can identify with that. And then the rest of that first verse, again, some of the best known words of this hymn anyway. I was once lost, now found. I was blind, but now I see. And so when we read those words for us as Christians, if we are Christians, then we have an immediate connection to the words, because they should bring us back to that very event where this came true for us. Where there was a time before my conversion when I was lost, but now found. I was blind, but now. See, there's supposed to be that connection. But again, you put this back when it was really popular in the 1800s, and you imagine at the end of this 2-week tent meeting where hundreds, maybe literally thousands of people have been converted to Christ, and they sing these words, and you think, how impactful is that? How recognizable is that for each person who has come to Christ? Maybe having no background in Christ or religion at all, but all of a sudden they've come to know Him, and now they were lost, but they have been found. So everything has changed that quickly. The text that was read for us in John chapter 9, in verse 25 there, we see the original phrase that this song borrows from, where the man that was blind, that has been healed by Christ, says back to the Pharisees, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Now, this is not a religious conversion that this man is experiencing, but it parallels pretty nicely. It shows that change of what happens when we encounter Jesus, that we don't know what's really what we could see until we see Him. In the second verse of the psalm, it says that it was grace that taught my heart to fear, but grace my fears relieved. So this song is again supposed to help us reflect on grace. One way it's going to do that in the second verse is bring out the two sides to grace. On the one hand, if you're talking about God's grace in general, God's grace is what brings about God's revelation. It brings about the Bible. God's grace gave us His Word. And so in that sense, you can kind of say that grace, through that revelation, has also brought a knowledge of sin. And certainly that is true. When we look at grace, you look at a passage like Romans 7, in verse 7, kind of going along with the idea of the old law being our schoolmaster that was mentioned earlier this morning. It says, I would not have known sin except through the law. Okay, so if God's grace has revealed His message, in part what that revealed is, I'm sinful. I wouldn't know that apart from the grace of God giving His law to mankind. But at the same time, when it says that grace my fears relieved, that same grace also revealed the solution to that problem. So God didn't just leave it at, here's my message, you're sinful, there's nothing you can do. He said, yes, you are sinful, but I have a plan. And so grace has revealed that plan as well, that Christ came to save. And then there's the statement that's made, still in this second verse of the psalm, that grace, when it appeared at the hour that I first believed, when grace does appear at first, I think for each of us that have been converted to Christ, we recognize that time period where we were first converted, and we say, you know what? Grace appeared as something pretty special in that moment and in the moments that followed that. But the question is, well, now that it's been a few weeks, now it's been a few months, a few years, a few decades since that moment, has that changed? Does grace appear as precious now to me as it did when I was first converted? And I think there's probably two answers to that. One, for all of us, the answer is maybe no, not quite emotionally. And yet, on the other hand, it should be that we have so much better understanding of grace and so much more appreciation now that we've lived a little bit longer of what that actually means, that maybe it's not the emotional high that we need to keep in mind or try to recover, but instead that grace appears more precious because we know so much more of what that grace has done, and it has done so much more. Well, in the third verse, that's kind of the idea. It is a very simple statement that's made in that third verse, and we won't spend too much time on it, but it's done in a way that makes it into poetry, that makes it beautiful in a way that it can remind us of what grace does. And so basically, in verse 3, Newton is saying that grace has gotten us to where we are, and it will also continue to do so. But in life, certainly, if we're reflecting on grace, that's part of what we want to think about is, remember that time that grace carried me through? Remember that next time that I thought everything was going to go wrong and then it didn't by the grace of God? Remember every single time that God's grace has stepped in and changed my life. If it can do that, and if it's done that already, then grace is also able to lead us home, as the verse ends there as well. So nothing earth-shattering as far as new information that we didn't know, that we wouldn't know without this song. And yet that's really what we want this song and other songs to be. It's a time for meditation on things that we do know, but maybe we just need a reminder every so often that this is what God's grace has done for us. In the fourth verse of the song, we get a couple more ideas here. The first one being, when we've been there 10,000 years. Now, the author of the song assumes that you know where he means. He doesn't really have to come out and say, when we've been what place 10,000 years? Well, when we've been with God for that time period, when we've been saved and in heaven for that time period, then certain things will be true. Now, what he says is that there'll be no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Okay? True, in a sense. But the beauty of the fourth verse in this song is that he is trying to explain, actually he's not trying to explain it, that would be the difficult part. But he's talking about something that is so far beyond our comprehension, which is the physics of eternity. It's not even the right way to say it. But he's talking about something that cannot be described, what it's like to be somewhere where time doesn't happen. All of our lives, we are getting older. We're watching the clock go by. We are seeing things progress. But none of that happens when we're in eternity. So when he uses language like 10,000 years, while that's a big number for us, in eternity it means nothing. And that's the point that he's making. And when he talks about a number of days, that there'll be no less days, well, that doesn't really mean anything in eternity. And yet, it does a pretty good job. And so he has taken something that is so immensely complex and put it into human terms, but done so in a way that makes it make a lot of sense to us. To say that when we've been there an amount of time that our minds can't even comprehend, that it will be like no time has passed. That's eternity. But what he says is that when that all happens, that we'll have no less time to be praising God. So that's the important part of why we're there in the first place. But I do wonder for each of us, what does that make us think when we start to contemplate being with God endlessly and praising him endlessly? Is there any apprehension there that thinks, is that going to get old? Is that going to be tiring? Is that going to be, or is it just maybe the more appropriate response, is it just joy? Is it just peace? Is it just safety, recognizing that we will be there with him, no matter how long, no matter what time scale we're talking about? That's where we want to be. That's where we need to be. That's our entire goal. So looking at this song as a whole, again, it's not that we don't know this song. We sing it all the time. We sing this song at funerals a lot of times because it does provide a certain comfort. We sing this whenever. But what do we take from the song? Well, the first thing that we can take, and I'll tie this back to the story of the man who wrote it, is that our story is not predetermined. What happens to us individually, it's not already set in stone. And John Newton serves as a very good example of that. By all accounts, Newton should have ended up, honestly, he probably should have ended up dead by about age 25 in some disastrous events, or maybe drinking himself to death, or whatever would have been the most common way to lose your life as a rough sailor in those days. That didn't happen. The other option is he could have ended up as an old, miserable, drunken crude individual, as most sailors probably would have, and that would have been his lot. But instead, he ends up completely different from that. Someone who was selling humans for profit goes from that to speaking out against it to eventually the end of his story. So he doesn't die until 1807. And the reason that 1807 matters, it'd be a lot later in American history, as you'll recall, but in the history of Britain, in 1807, the British slave trade is ended, about 6 months before John Newton's death. And so he goes in his life from starting life, selling slaves, to getting to see the practice end that he's been speaking out against for decades by the time that he dies. There's a good bit of irony there as well. But again, his story starts off terribly, but it ends up being a story of redemption, not through him, but through God. And so the way that our story goes, it doesn't really matter how it starts, because our story starts again when we find out who God is. Our story begins when we find out who God is. It doesn't matter how old you are. You could be 10 years old, you could be 80 years old, but if you find out who God is, everything can still change. And that's what the song we're looking at this morning tells us, that your life changes when you find what grace is. Along with that, this is kind of a historical observation to make as well. Grace has to be extended not just by God, but from man to man. And that grace has to extend backwards a little bit. So, John Newton, as we've said, was a slave trader. That is a pretty big mark on his record against him. And there's a good portion of society today that would maybe say that this song just shouldn't be sung because it's tied to someone who did this wickedness. And there's a push to kind of stamp out any history, especially that relates to this evil that was being done. And yet, what that really ends up doing is taking this song and throwing it out entirely, not just based on the author, but throwing out the words with it. Because grace, to a certain extent, has to work backwards and say, yeah, that's true. He did do that. But how do I want to be judged? Do I want to be judged based off of the worst things that I've ever done? Or do I want people to judge me through this lens of amazing grace that God judges through? Well, certainly if that's the way I want to be judged, then that's the way I ought to judge others. Grace is the answer, as we've seen individually, to the answer to sin. It's the answer to what individually we do with our lives. But it's also the answer to bigger problems. And I think this story shows that as well. Grace is the answer even to international problems of human trafficking. Grace has a solution for that, if enough people are willing to look toward it. Eventually that did happen in this case, but there's still a lot more things that grace can change. On the individual note, grace is only as effective, or grace is only as amazing as my understanding is of sin. That's kind of a weird way to phrase that, but there's a lot of truth to it. If I recognize myself as being a decent person, someone who is not so bad, kind of righteous enough to get by, then what is grace to me? It's not amazing. It's okay. It helps me. But it's nothing that's amazing. But if I instead bring myself back to this level, maybe looking at the sins of my past, and I say that I am a wretch, I'm a person who's been banished from God, totally undeserving of this. If I recognize, like in Romans chapter 5 and verse 8, that God demonstrated his own love toward us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. If I'm the sinner in the story, if I'm still the wretch in the story, grace is amazing. But as soon as I start to think, well, that's not really me. That's not really who I am. I was never that rebellious against God. And I start to replace the truth with a shadow of what I start to think, then grace stops being amazing. And that's not something that we ever want to allow. But this song, every time we sing it, hopefully reminds us that it is amazing. It's still just as amazing as when we first believed. And, as the song also says, it's going to be amazing 10,000 years from now. If the earth stands for another 10,000 years, do you think people will still sing this song? I think if there's any Christians left, probably. If the earth doesn't stand for another 10,000 years, you think this song might get sung around God's throne? Maybe. Either way, this song is a reminder to each of us that God has extended His grace that can change every part of our life, and should. But this morning, if you need to respond to God's grace, He has offered a way to be saved by that grace. He's laid out His plan for that salvation. We talk about it a lot, but we hear the message of grace. We believe it to be true. We confess that we are that wretch. We change. We repent. We're baptized into Him. We live according to that grace going forward. This morning, if you need to take those steps, this is the time. This morning, if you need to respond in other ways to God's grace, this is also your opportunity. If you come forward as we stand, as we sing.
I